When I was asked to do this by John Chamberlain, who's on our board and is very interested in what we're doing with climate change, I put together a little program based on what we're already doing. And I wrote a little haiku that's up on the board, which probably violates some of the rules of haikus, but I gave myself only 30 minutes, so I found it. So what are we seeing in Arkansas by climate change? And what stirred me to do a little localized research on this was that conversation in Monroe County. What are those things that you could go on the web of the National Weather Service, gather data on, analyze it your own self, and see change, or see the impacts of climate change? And these are a few of them that I think you might find interesting. If you look at the weather gauges in Fayetteville, Little Rock, and Memphis, which are the oldest ones we have in Arkansas, with the longest data streams, and analyze the pattern that you see over the last 60 years, you actually see only a fairly small, less than a 3/4 of a degree rise in mean temperature. The interesting part of that is almost all of that rise is in the average high-low temperature. So nighttime temperatures and winter temperatures, on the low end, almost all of the rise has been there. It does, because low temperatures is what tells you what your growing season is. And if you look at I know you can get that, NRCS, I think, develops it, the growing seasons in Arkansas by when you should start growing your tomato plants in your garden. Probably has an official name, I can't think of what it is. There used to be 3, and all 3 of those have moved. One has moved all the way up into Missouri. And so, hardiness zones, exactly, that's what I was thinking, thank you. So, our winters are warmer, our nighttime temperatures are warmer, and our growing seasons are longer. And if you talk to farmers in the Delta, they'll say, yep, that's right. The seasonal rainfall patterns, although we're not seeing an increase or a decrease in mean precipitation over that period of time, we're seeing a seasonal shift. Before 1950, you could look at a rainfall graph, and it would be by month, inches by month, and it would be pretty flat. 3 to 4 inches each month across the year, hardly any deviation. Now there's a distinct pattern of more rainfall in the spring and the fall, all coming from the causing a drier summer. So if you think about how plants grow in Arkansas, we have very high rates of evapotranspiration in the late summer. It's hot, right? And now we're getting less rain in August and September. And instead of on the average, we would have 2 weeks, and this is just an average, 2 weeks every year where we'd have a water deficit, so that rainfall was not replenishing soil moisture. Now it's about 3.5 weeks. It's actually more noticeable on the Fayetteville gauge, less noticeable on the Memphis gauge. I only analyzed 3 gauges, and I didn't publish this data, so you've got to take it for what it's worth. But you can look it up and do it yourself. we're getting higher intensity rainfall in all seasons. And so instead of getting rainfall that's gentle and long-term, over a period of a few days, we're getting a lot of rainfall in single rain events all at once. In all seasons. And that's probably a factor partially caused by that small increase in the low temperatures and the air holding more moisture. Because of that, our stream flow patterns have changed. If you look at stream gauges in watersheds that are still forested, so don't pick an urban watershed, what you'll find is bank full events. A bank full event is an event which just fills up the channel but doesn't flood over. A bank full event before 1950 would have occurred on average about every 18 months. And now on average it's happening every 9 months. And that's statewide. And those are directly related to the higher intensity rainfall patterns. And so these observations, and one reason I think Arkansas maybe has lagged in recognizing climate change as a challenge, are just subtle. It's not like the permafrost melting under your house or the rise in sea level in coastal Louisiana, where you're actually standing in the water. And it just took Arkansans maybe a little longer to recognize that climate change was happening to them. This is my only geeky data slide, almost unintelligible, but there is a paper that was written recently called Nature-Based Solutions. And we're basically a nature organization. So the kinds of solutions that we want to come up with for climate change are going to be based around nature. I don't know anything about buildings or transport grids or anything like that. And so we analyzed all the possibilities, not me personally, and this paper has been published and is available, on what are those things that we can do using nature to most effectively address climate change. And what this paper showed was some things that are probably obvious to all of us, but now we have data to support it. So just to describe the colors, the darker gray means it's less expensive. The lighter gray means more expensive, relatively. But the thing that gives us most bang for our buck is reforestation. No surprise there, probably. The second thing, partly because it's also very, very cheap, is avoid cutting down the forest in the first place. Or not cutting down. This deals with conversion. Avoid converting it to some other use in the first place. So in one section, you're creating something that's going to withdraw carbon from the atmosphere, and in the other, you're conserving carbon in a carbon sink. Thirdly, it's natural forest management. So if you think about Arkansas's forests, almost all of them, except for the deep swamps, are historically maintained or by fire. Fire is a very important ecosystem process to keep these forests healthy. And without that kind of management, you lose some of the effectiveness of keeping forested areas forested. And there's a few other things that you hear people talk about in the news media, like all of these kind of animal management stuff. And there is some stuff, and there is things to do here in nutrient management that might be useful. But the big ones were those three. So what are we doing particularly to address the three things that we think we could do most efficiently in the sense of cost and opportunity? Well, reforestation absorbed, like I said, directly from the atmosphere. Conserving natural habitats protects your existing carbon sinks, and natural forest management builds resiliency into your forests. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about appropriate infrastructure. Because given the changes we're seeing in climate, some of our infrastructure is impacting the natural world by its failure. So one of the biggest successes that we can really crow about in Arkansas is the reforestation of the Delta. Since the early mid-90s, we and our partnership group, which is pretty substantial, has reforested about 250,000 acres. And we've conserved in the sense of acquiring and turning over to a permanent protection about another 100,000 acres. Until we've been able to create a corridor almost half a million acres in extent along the Lower White and Cache rivers and Bayou de View. This is a pretty amazing conservation success. So successful, you can't really see it well unless you're flying over it. Yes, ma'am. Oh, that is a brilliant question. You know, the Delta is pretty much depopulated of young people. So the jobs there were with the immigrant community. Yes, particularly Hispanics, but not only Hispanics. There's one of my friends there. And this is just kind of a map of some of the different types of ownerships and programs. Well, what's happened since now the Trump administration, it's all gone mechanical. So think about, we've gone from, and this is just an aside, I wasn't going to talk about this, but I might as well. We've gone from the human labor of creating jobs and putting people to work, even though they were immigrants, to now because these immigrants are no longer available to us, to doing this all by mechanical means and using a lot of diesel to do it. It's very unfortunate. Because they can't come to the country anymore. Well, yeah, exactly. And so what this looks like from the ground, yeah.
When you clear cut the pine trees and replant the young ones, does that increase or decrease?
Let me get to that, because I figured that would be a question. So I have a slide for that. So what this looks like from the ground is this was the existing riparian forest around Bayou de View. It was acquired and it's now in the National Wildlife Refuge, about 30,000 acres, well, 15 miles of stream. And around that, there's about another 30,000 acres of restored land. So this is a pretty big deal. But to put it in context, we have not yet recovered through this reforestation the amount of forest cover that we had that preceded the soybean boom. If anybody was here during the 1970s, you will remember that soybeans went very high, and the farmers were encouraged to clear their fields and clear their woods and put it in soybeans, and they did. And we have not returned this landscape to what it was in the 1970s yet. Similarly, with other places in Arkansas, there was an interesting discussion in one of the other groups from the Northwest Arkansas Regional Land Trust about being strategic about your acquisition and preservation of natural habitats, because scattered 40-acre tracts all over the state just just never quite build up into something really sustainable. And to avoid that, there's been a lot of work done figuring out what kind of habitats most need protection and how we can link those into a larger group of protected areas to maintain ecological sustainability as the climate changes. Gene flow and patterns of animal movement and migration. This is just a map of the pine flatwoods of South Arkansas, which was going under a tremendous rate of conversion up through the recent recession in 2008. So fast that we thought it would be gone within 5 years. The recession, which impacted so many people negatively, actually hurt the timber industry quite hard, and that conversion has recently slowed. But it was a system that was disappearing from the landscape. And third, let's talk a little bit about natural forest management. And this is going to get finally to your question, ultimately. Because the ecological basis for our oak and pine woodlands is one that is really inherently tied to natural and human-caused wildfires over the last 10,000 years. And without that intercession of fire, this is actually a very common look in the Ozarks, in parts of the Ozarks that are fire suppressed. And biodiversity and resiliency in these forests is very low. And their ability to absorb carbon is stable. In other words, they're not absorbing carbon at this point. They're a reservoir, but they're not returning any more additional carbon to the soil. With management, although you'll get a slightly different vision of this forest, it's one that is much richer in biodiversity of all kinds. And because of the healthy herbaceous layer, it's one that continues to absorb carbon over time. Because every time it's burned, the leaf and plant litter turns into little bits of charcoal and is reabsorbed into the soil and used by the plants that regrow. And so this is not only a carbon sink, it's one that's continuing to add additional carbon to the system. And you need that fire management to keep these systems resilient. You also, through burning, return some carbon back to the atmosphere. This is what I'm going to call fast carbon. The carbon cycle comes in different periods depending on what's producing it. If you're burning fossil carbon that was laid down 300 million years ago through a different geological process, that's slow carbon. And we're never going to see it go back easily. Carbon from sources that are natural in the sense of a healthy ecosystem, that carbon is reabsorbed in the next growing season out of the atmosphere by growing plants. So pine plantations. Pine plantations are not resilient systems. They are ripe for catastrophic wildfire and insect outbreak. And so if you're thinking about changing climates, these plantations, which cover millions of acres in Arkansas and much of the Gulf Coastal Plain of South Arkansas, are one of the most risky things we've done to the landscape. We have not suffered a fire like the Bastrop Ridge in Texas or Gatlinburg in Kentucky or the fires in Paradise, California, yet. But we will. And we will be on the front page across this whole country when it happens. Because this situation is not sustainable. And you'll hear about sustainable forestry. But this plantation system in the face of climate change is not sustainable. But it can be restored using the same methods foresters would have used for generations. And it can be restored fairly rapidly with fire and the thinning of the forest in such a way to allow sunlight to reach the ground. So these are restorable systems, but they're not sustainable as a plantation. It could not restore themselves without fire. And so I would say, given the way, so it would not restore itself without fire, and if you allowed nature to take its course here, that fire would be a catastrophic one. So it would replace the whole stand at one time, instead of doing it, mechanically and restoring it in a relatively short period of time and maintaining the carbon stocks. In South Arkansas, no, because the plant that they're planting in the plantations is the native species. So we're lucky in that sense because that's not always the case. But for us, it is okay. And the Nature Conservancy being a global organization, we have the opportunity to work with a lot of partners out of the country. And it's a fascinating thing that to learn over time is that, people's problems are kind of all the same and at the same time completely different. So in Zambia, there's a national park called Kafue National Park. It's huge, maybe 4 times the size of Yellowstone. And their problem was they were getting these huge late dry season fires, which would basically over a period of a month burn virtually the entire area. And at first it was hard to figure out why. And it was actually blamed on climate change by some people. But come to find out, it's not quite, everything's more complex than you think, of course. And the problem in Zambia, in Kafue National Park, is that poaching has reduced the animal stocks to such a low level that nothing's eating the fuel. So instead of 100,000 elephants, they have 5,000. Well, the impact of 100,000 elephants on this landscape is pretty dramatic, as you could imagine. And 5,000 isn't enough. And so until they can figure out a way to reduce poaching to allow the animal stocks to rebuild and both eat and trample the fuel load, they're going to have to suffer through some pretty catastrophic wildfires. And so the place where we could help was we could show them ways to burn early in the dry season when the grasses were still green and the fire intensity at that time is low, to keep the fires later in the season from becoming uncontrollable catastrophes. And at the same time, Kafue is half grass and half woodland. We could protect the remaining woodlands from these catastrophic wildfires. So we've been doing this for a while now, and this is a picture of one of the first burns we did there about 12 years ago. And this is the photo point. And look at the difference in carbon stocks by a place that is under management and not subject to catastrophic wildfires. So this is a tropical system with very fast regenerative growth. And that's all now carbon sink in these woodlands that we've been able to protect with early growing season wildfire. waiting while they get poaching under control well enough so the animal stocks can rebuild themselves. Okay, my final problem. One of the things that we're seeing with this increased intensity rainfall and hence runoff is Arkansas has a lot of rural roads that are dirt and gravel. And heavy rain, we know what heavy rains does to a dirt and gravel road if it's poorly maintained or poorly built or sited. All the sediment runs off the road, pretty much runs into your creeks, and then it runs into our rivers. And that impacts the things we most care about, which is the fish and mussels and crayfish that live in the rivers. How many people have seen this kind of thing happen? Never in Arkansas. And then what happens? The county judge gets a call. He sends the dump truck out and fills in the hole, and then it rains again. And it washes back down into the river. Same here. You get a heavy rain, you get those big rains big enough that even FEMA gets involved. Well, you know what FEMA pays for? Building back exactly what was there before. How many times can they do that before they figure out, well, so our infrastructure in rural areas in particular may have been inadequate really to begin with. But under all the climate scenarios that we see, it's becoming more inadequate. And we're having all of these old bridges, culverts that are undersized fail rapidly. And all that sediment goes into the rivers. And as it does, the river itself adjusts to that sediment by increasing its flopping back and forth against the banks. And then the banks start failing, like this. It adds up to a lot of problem with sediment. This is actually the middle fork of the Little Red River, which flows in to Greer's Ferry Lake here, and right here is Clinton's water supply, which they just had to spend $2 million on for a clarifier to remove the sediment from their drinking water. So it's an issue that's not going to go away, but it's also one with solutions. Very interesting woman who went before me, because there are solutions to these problems, and one of them is Penn State actually has a Center for Dirt and Gravel Road Technology. Who would have thought that? Until we started addressing all these problems, we didn't know. But they do have solutions for many of these things. And it just means you have to build it right the first time and maintain it well, and ultimately your costs are less. And for a rural county in Arkansas, road maintenance, that's their biggest budget item. On the right. So the water in this, for here, the water is going right down the river, right down the road, every time it rains. So all that sediment is going down to the creek and into the river. And all this does is divert the water off the road into a culvert that takes it to a sediment trap. And the cost of this is not very high. It's a tough piece of rubber, almost like a tire, that you can drive over and a million times it's not going to go anywhere. Same with the bridges and culverts. Some of this here is in Calhoun County, and it washed out. The first time I saw it wash out was after Katrina and Rita and all those hurricanes that hit earlier in the decade. But since then, they've repaired it many times with chunks of concrete and gravel. They've spent tens of thousands of dollars repairing this bridge unsuccessfully until they were able to get a grant to build an adequate structure that allows the free flow of water under increased rain events and there's always a maintenance cost with all these structures, but nothing like what they were going through with that cement structure they had in the river. And so that's kind of what we're working on, or what TNC is working on with its partners. And given the way, climate change, I think, is becoming less controversial or divisive in some parts of Arkansas's public, I think the chance for doing more is, and doing it because for climate change reasons, and as an explanation is increasing. And so going forward, the TNC will use a very straightforward operating procedure to just bring people along where we need to make sure that we can work toward protecting ourselves from reducing the impacts of climate change, but at the same time knowing we're going to have climate change no matter what we do at this point, protecting ourselves into the future. And that's all I have.